Hello, everyone. Warmest welcome, especially to our guests to Hong Kong. Sorry to be running a bit late, but we are on our way now. So again, welcome to all of us with us in our beautiful moot court room today. And also warmest welcome to all our participants who's joining us on Zoom. So we will be starting off with a number of welcome messages. To start us off, as you know, this event is organized by the Center for Medical Ethics and Law. Now, this center is a joint center, the center of the Faculty of Law at the University of Hong Kong, and also the LKS Faculty of Medicine, which is on a separate campus from this one, for those who are familiar with the HKU premises. So I thought it's very appropriate for me to start off by welcoming my co-director, Professor Gilberto Leung. Professor Leung is Associate Dean at the LKS Faculty of Medicine. He holds many positions, so we're very privileged to have him with us because he's an incredibly busy man, which also speaks to his competence. As some of you may know, he's also a neurosurgeon by profession, so extremely busy, yes. And currently the president of the Hong Kong Academy of Medicine. So I don't need to mention more how important he is. So that said, and without further ado, Gilberto, welcome.
Thank you.
Floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone. Please don't believe anything that Calvin said about me. It's mostly exaggerated, but it is my honor really to be here today. I'm a co-director of the CMEL, which is itself an establishment jointly founded by the two faculties. It's a really interesting, exciting learning and research platform. I'm a clinician, mostly, when I'm not forwarding emails, etc. And over the past few years, many of my colleagues and myself had been disturbed, misled, confused, even traumatized by a lot of disinformation and misinformation we found on social media. Things about how we should fight the COVID, vaccination, mask wearing, etc. But in the end, it was the public that ultimately suffered, our patients and indirectly our profession as well. So it was not an easy time, and we have tried to find ways to resolve this, but it was impossible. We had tried to even find people who could help us resolve this, and there was no such channel. So I think it's really important and exciting now that we are looking back and looking forward at the same time to explore this particular issue that we are addressing here today, social listening, infodemics, and how we should establish better governance for this very important issue, not only for an epidemic, but in all aspects of society, and how we can move forward, especially in this digital age, AI, and the very widespread use of social media. So I'm just really looking forward to this program. I'm very grateful for Calvin having put together this wonderful program. I don't know how come he sort of got to know so many people while he's working very hard at Hong Kong U, but I'm very grateful for his hard work in forming this wonderful line of speakers. So I'll stop here. Welcome again to Hong Kong. Welcome to Hong Kong U. And I hope you all enjoy a very enjoyable conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gilberto. I would also, of course, like to take this opportunity to thank the Law and Technology Center, which is one of the research centers here at the Faculty of Law, HKU. We are very privileged to be joined by Marcelo. We'll be hearing from Professor Marcelo Thompson tomorrow. I'd like to take this opportunity, of course, to thank all our colleagues who have flown in from Brazil. We've got quite a few of our colleagues here. It's a long way to travel, so warmest welcome to Hong Kong. We look forward to learning about the situation in Brazil and some of your experiences there. But meanwhile, it's over to Marcelo with a few messages from his center. Thanks again, Marcelo.
Thank you. Thank you very much. No, I just prepared, since we have like 1 hour for the panel, I prepared just brief remarks, which I'm just going to engage with here with you. So distinguished guests, esteemed colleagues, all those who are joining us from all over the world in this thoughtful journey of the coming 3 days and 1 night, on behalf of the Law and Technology Center at the University of Hong Kong, let me first tell you how delighted I am to welcome you here, and second, to congratulate my friend and colleague, Calvin W.L, on the fantastic program he and colleagues at the Center for Medical Ethics and Law have put together. Sociology speaks of modernity as a reflexive progress, a reflexive process through which abstract systems of science, technology, knowledge, expertise, are transformed by the very social undertakings that they in turn go on to transform. Our enterprise in the coming days, and please pardon the simplicity of the thought, is just of such a reflexive nature, and most avowedly so. We're endeavoring to listen about social listening, and in the course of doing so, I'm afraid we will be noting, registering, archiving as much as we'll be listening. Will be as much understanding about the boundaries between technological platforms and governments and social actors generally, as we'll be helping define such boundaries in the quintessential realm of affairs that concern nothing else but human life. We'll speak of changing attitudes towards platforms, towards the internet, as much as we'll be enacting the changing fabric of these attitudes. There could not indeed be a more thoughtful and yet circumstantial, material, living discussion than the one we are about to embark on. I very much look forward to socially listening to all of you. Thank you very much for joining us, and I look forward to discussions.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Marcelo. Well, I've got some slides, so let me get to this. Let me again start off with some acknowledgements, beginning with the Law and Technology Center. We just heard from Marcelo. Unfortunately, the director of the center was unable to make it, but he sends his wishes as well, Professor Felix Cheng. So I'd like to thank Felix and Marcelo. So Marcelo's been very kind. He's had a big role in helping to put this conference together. So thank you so much, Marcelo, for working with myself and Gilberto in getting this conference going. Thank you so much. We are very grateful to the Mehu team. We do have some of our colleagues from there. Dr. Julie Chan is unfortunately out of country, so she's not able to join us here, but we're very grateful for her support as well as that of her team. We have two colleagues from Mehu here with us actually, so Zoha at the back and then Ria here as well. So warmest welcome. We hope you get to interact with our wonderful speakers from all over the world, and very keen to hear your thoughts about this very important topic too. We are extremely grateful to our Dean. So I've invited Dean Professor Hualing Fu to say a few words, but he's been very modest. He says no, he'd prefer to be in the audience. So he's actually seated there. So that's our Dean. Thank you so much, Dean, for your wonderful support. And it's also thanks to his support that we have wonderful use of this beautiful moot court room, as you see. The view is excellent outside, so if you get a chance during the break, you might just want to step out and enjoy the wonderful scenery that is Hong Kong. We are also grateful to Dean Professor Lau, who is at the medical school, for the wonderful support, and also to Professor Vivian Lin. You will be meeting Professor Lin tomorrow, because she'll be here. And for those our international guests at dinner tonight, you will also be able to meet with her. Vivian has spent quite a long duration working with the Western Pacific regional office of WHO. So I should mention that, given that a number of our WHO colleagues are in the audience. On behalf of Gilberto and myself, I'd like to thank our wonderful donors, Wing Foundation. So they have been an incredible source of support. And in fact, this event is only possible because of their generous contribution. So very grateful to Wing Foundation. Hopefully you get to meet one of the key individuals, Dr. Anthony Tung, who is closely linked to the organ of the foundation, and of course one of our board members, Miss Anna Wu. Anna should be at dinner tonight, so for our international guests, you get the chance to meet with an amazing person. So Anna, shortly. I'd like to thank our WHO colleagues. So many of you would already know, and in the audience is Dr. Andreas Reis. So thank you so much, Andreas, for the wonderful support. He has helped to link us up with many of our colleagues around the world, and of course, an illustration of the wonderful convening power of the World Health Organization. Of course, this particular work is also very important because it's in fact, this meeting, one of the intended outputs, as you see, is to support WHO in developing an ethics guidance document. So it's not just a purely academic sort of discussion. We hope that there will be concrete policy outputs coming out of the discussion here. And I'd like to acknowledge and thank Dr. Tina Pune, who's not able to join us because of, well, some administrative matters, but she is represented by Sandra. So welcome, Sandra. We'll be hearing from her tomorrow. But I'd like to acknowledge my thanks to WHO for the wonderful support. Yeah, and of course, the opportunity to contribute on this front. Thank you. I've mentioned our board member, Ms. Anna Wu, so thank you again, Anna. We look forward to meeting you this evening in person. And I'd like to acknowledge and thank my colleague, Dr. Carl Haas. So he's seated there. Many of you may have, of course, met him, but we will be hearing him on Thursday as well. So thank you so much, Carl, for your help with getting the program together and also the booklet. He is also helping us with social media. So if you're an active social media person, please do link up with him and perhaps you can well become part of the network, a huge network that is already established. So thanks so much, Paul. Of course, we should not forget Candy and Jane. So I have Candy here. I think many of us would have been in touch with Candy. So Candy, as you can just wave. Thank you so much, Candy, for the wonderful help. And of course, Jane. So both of them work as a team. You may not have been in direct contact with her, but they're very closely connected in terms of all the logistics and communications that you've had with Candy. So thank you so much to you both for getting the event all together. Thank you. And finally, of course, to all our speakers and participants, this meeting would not be possible without yourself taking the effort to travel and to interact with us. So we're immensely grateful for your time and for this opportunity to be in conversation. And also those who are joining us via Zoom, we're very grateful for your spending time with us. If you should have any comments, please do feel free to share them. Your thoughts will be very welcome, and I believe very helpful to the discussions that we will have. Jane will speak later on about how you could add comments to through the platform, and also about the simultaneous translation service. So some of our colleagues are joining us from mainland China. You might like to note, if you haven't already, that you are able to access the Mandarin channel. So everything that is presented here is simultaneously translated through our colleagues in the box. So special thanks to our translators as well. You see them in that small box at the corner. So thank you so much. So very quickly about the goals of the meeting, that has been set out in the documents, no surprise to everyone, but I think it might be helpful to recap for the benefit of those joining us via Zoom. We want to try to understand better the modalities of social listening. Is a new area, so it's not to be assumed that there is a set of processes or technologies that we could take for granted to be applied in social listening. So we want to try to problematize that a bit. But you see, unlike the WHO project that I'll speak a bit about later on, we want to broaden the focus a bit. So it's not just in response to an infodemic arising from an epidemic or an outbreak, but we want to broaden that to include some of the serious health threats, including, for example, antimicrobial resistance or AMR, because that's a huge challenge moving forward. So we want to, time permitting, think about some of these other ongoing health threats, just as serious, if not more so, if we think about some of the NCDs, the non-communicable diseases, for example. And then we want to think about the ways in which social listening can be used to identify misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation or harmful information, as well as public health interventions that may be applied in response. So there are clearly many ethical, legal, and governance issues. So we are keen to tease out some of these issues and to try to think about what's the best way or the most responsible way forward. So that, as you see, will be one of the main focus of the conference, given that many of our colleagues gathered here are either scholars in law or ethics, or are very familiar with the sort of developments, especially on the ethical and regulatory front. There are a number of important developments around the world. So you see that, and I'm pleased to say, within the audience, right, we have representation from all continents except Antarctica. So we should get a sense of developments from around the world. It's not going to be comprehensive, of course, but it's at least, I think at this point, a good sampling of some of the key issues that have surfaced and how we could start to think about ways moving forward. And as I've mentioned, and it's really worth repeating, there's going to be a clear output on the policy front. We do hope that all of these discussions will contribute to the policy discussion. But as you'll see shortly, we also hope that there will be academic outputs in order to continue to contribute to this very important field of knowledge. And of course, my own personal interest in ways that is fair and equitable. And finally, of course, we want to try to consider some of the oversight mechanisms, hearing again from the experiences that have come out around the world in response to COVID-19, a pandemic that is just passed. So a bit of a primer in terms of what an infodemic is. As you'd see, this is also set up in the introductory material. For those who are with us on Zoom, you might want to look at the booklet that's been circulated. The program booklet provides this particular definition from the World Health Organization. Again, I'd like to highlight that the definition itself is linked to an outbreak or epidemic. In this particular conference, we want to try to broaden the scope a bit to consider some of the ongoing challenges, NCDs, and as well as AMR in particular. There is a working definition, so to speak, of social listening. It comes from a report published by Gavi, UNICEF, WHO, and international partners. So again, we want to revisit this. In fact, we'll be hearing very shortly from a number of our colleagues who will speak more to this. So how we to understand social listening, especially social listening, practices of social listening that have been applied for a long time within a research context, but now moving very strongly into public health. And of course, you also have the enhancement of these particular approaches with digital technology. So, of course, an amplification, I would think, of a number of ethical as well as regulatory concerns. And from a global health standpoint, how do we think about all of these developments in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals? Of course, we are committed to the SDGs. How do all of these developments ultimately facilitate or perhaps hold us back from achieving the SDGs? So a number of issues that we want to consider. I thought just to set out from, and this comes from the Gavi 2021 report. So there is a particular process that's been set out, and I thought in this slide, it quite nicely set out what it from the standpoint of that report understands to be social listening, you see that there is a broad range of modalities. The focus of the report will be on the enhancement of a number of these modalities through digital means. I will see in a while what they are. How this feeds into understanding. It's a particular construction of understanding. I want to problematize that because the approach that is taken has a commitment to particular values that might come into conflict with other values that we would consider important. So what are these values, these other values that might be left out or not sufficiently engaged with? And ultimately, are communities effectively engaged? And how do these modalities address their concerns, particularly in the time of an outbreak? So, so this will be at one level, because the more complicated level, hopefully we get to engage with, will be when we have politics and power coming in. So how do all of these interface with political systems and political agenda that may be incongruous or totally out of sync with public health commitments or goals? So that's a discussion that hopefully we will have. I'm not sure that we will have a lot of time to go into the engagement space. Of course, this is just, I would like to think, the start of a conversation, but I think it's important to flag that. We'll be hearing from some of our speakers highlighting what are the things that we ought to be mindful of as we move this agenda forward. But at least for a start, we have this in our scope of view. So that's what we have from the 2021 Gavi document, of which WHO is a contributor. We will hear very shortly, especially from Sandra, who's with us today, right? Another scheme that has recently been announced, and that's social listening in relation to insight report generation. So ultimately, we'd see that one of the objectives, one of the goals of applying social listening is to help develop an insight report that can then guide public health intervention. So when we think about that, well, Sandra can correct me if I'm wrong, but the way that I read it, we would find that the first 3 stages will speak to essentially what we understand, at least from the Gavi 2021 report standpoint, right? What we understand social listening to be. So we can think about that in terms of the process, but we want to, while we're focused on the first 3 steps, we want to look at the entire process and to try to understand some of the implications that can come from that, particularly the ethical, legal, as well as the governance kind of issues, some of which I will highlight shortly. I'm going to put this out here, and then I thought what's really helpful is in the report, right, how these various data sources are expected to come together in order to generate the sort of insights that we ought to have for the purposes of understanding the concerns of communities or, in fact, or affected individuals during an outbreak. So very quickly, in the interest of time, right, we'll be hearing more from our WHO colleagues about some of the developments within WHO and their contribution to the science of infodemiology. My hope is also when we hear from the various jurisdictions to understand what are some of the implications and, more importantly, for the purposes of this conference, right, to tease out what the ethical and legal issues are. Very importantly, our human rights colleagues will also provide an important perspective on a number of these developments. I've already mentioned the sort of focal area that the Gavi document has, and if you're thinking about the digital health modality, so that would be one in terms of AI enhanced social listening platform. You'd see that as far as the schemes that we've considered the Gavi approach, the earlier 3-step process. And then we've considered the WHO's approach in the Insight Report Generation Manual. So all of this would feed into a sort of a risk metric in order to facilitate assessment and communication. And here is where I think we could focus in better understanding what are some of the implicit values and what might be some of the values as well as considerations that might have been left out in the process. So risk assessment, of course, is important, but it's one approach. There are other approaches. What are the other approaches, and what are the other normative commitments we ought to think about in the process? So yeah, just a bit more about the various platforms that are involved. So thanks to Marcelo and colleagues, they've been looking a lot at platform governance. So we'll get to hear a bit more about this. And as all of these various discussions are to feed into a number of avenues that are essentially work in process, we hope to, again, to highlight, draw on these discussions in ways that are useful in contributing to the ethics guidance document that's being developed by an expert panel. Some of the members are here. Also in moving us forward in terms of ethical thinking around the concerns. I thought this cube is quite interesting because our colleagues, some of you who are from the expert panel of WHO, right, Ross Upshur, he mentioned this particular wisdom in that we ought to develop in deliberating over all of these various issues. So an expression of this notion of this wisdom that could come from discussion and deep thinking about these issues is in this particular form a cubical representation of what it could mean, but I thought I would just put that out there for consideration. So there are many different frameworks in place. I've made reference to two of them. We are going to hear from our colleagues on a number more. I thought I'd highlight that, for example, the Association of International Researchers have got an ethical guidance document. We'll be hearing very shortly from Terry about this. So thank you so much, Terry. I'm going to put you on the spot a bit, but as we've heard, for some of us who are on the panel, we've heard Terry speak on this, but we'll hear a bit more on that. So that's one framework looking at social listening from an essentially research standpoint, but then of course the transition to public health is going to be one of the key concerns that we will have to engage with. There are a number of ethical frameworks in place already from WHO. We'll hear from Giovanni and Federico on how all these could potentially come together and affect thinking in this space. And then, of course, we have an important human rights document that's been published by the Global Health Law Consortium, as well as the International Commission on Jurists. So we have got Rujin and Lisa joining us. So very much looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this important development. So we want to try to draw on some of the human rights concept and to see how it could help guide development in this space. Obviously, all the UN agencies are committed to human rights, and therefore it's important that we understand what some of the concerns and approaches are in this particular space. So a number of possible outputs, just to mention my last slide before we hear from our keynote speaker, and sorry to run over time a bit. We are hoping to put together at least one, I'm going to be a bit ambitious to say that we are targeting potentially more. So at least one special issue of a peer review journal. Given that this is a very mixed group of scholars, we thought that a bioethics journal is, well, an obvious forum because it's hugely interdisciplinary. But I think we can also consider a public health journal, which of course public health being also by its nature interdisciplinary. More specialized outputs could also be considered, and this could be perhaps in comparative law, human rights, or otherwise in health policy. So these are some options. Collaborative papers are very welcome. So I'd just like to invite all participants to think about possibilities on this front. If you think that there might be some means of working together across disciplines, please do feel free to share that with us. There'll be some time on the last day of the conference to think about some possibilities here. So that would be on collaborative papers. There will be conference proceedings coming out of this particular meeting. There is also possibly going to be an edited monograph. So what we try to do with a special issue is to also spin off an edited monograph with one of our usual publishing colleagues, for example, Springer, whom we've had a long relationship with. Again, to note, of course, no surprise, since I've mentioned it a few times, the WHO ethics guidance document that will that we hope will be facilitated in the course of this discussion. Of course, if you should have any interest on this front, for those who are not already on the expert panel, please feel free to let me know. And finally, given that we have got different jurisdictions involved in this meeting, it'd be wonderful to try to develop critical reflective case studies. We think that experiences from around the world with COVID-19 is instructive, and we want to try to draw more out of it. So that's also one potential output from this meeting. So with this, a bit about the conference itself. As you know, this is a 3-day meeting that is somewhat linked, but different focal areas that we want to try to engage with. The very first segment this morning is on social listening. And then in the afternoon session, my colleague, Professor Kelly Loper, is going to join us. She will chair the human rights discussion. She is also responsible for the human rights program at the law school. So that's where we also get to hear more from Rujin and Lisa. So thank you so much. On Wednesday, we want to think about some of the struggles that have emerged in the context of vaccination and COVID-19. So some discussions there. So that's starting from the afternoon. So just to note again, right, that for tomorrow, our arrangements is a bit different from today because we will only start from 1:30 Hong Kong time. So the reason for this is because we will also end later. We will have an evening session. The reason for this is that we have many of our medical and law colleagues who would like to join us in person, but by reason of work, they can only manage an evening session. So this is really to accommodate them. So there will be an opportunity to meet with a number of our practitioner colleagues who will join us for that session. So we start late tomorrow, but we also end late tomorrow. And finally, the last day of the meeting on Thursday, as you see, focused on concerns of justice, as well as hearing more about examples. And you see, in terms of the presentations on third day, the focus is very much on South and Southeast Asia, as opposed to, of course, the East Asia and North American focus that's coming on tomorrow. So a jurisdictional divide there. So with this, welcome again to Hong Kong and wishing everyone a very successful conference ahead. Thank you very much. And without further ado, I'd like to invite my colleague Marcelo to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Larry Becker. So Marcelo, over to you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Calvin, for setting out the scene for the event. Now it is my privilege to welcome our friend and colleague who is joining us from afar from the US, just arrived yesterday, like many of you here as well. It's our privilege to have Professor Larry Catá Baker, who is the W. Richard and Mary Eshelman Faculty Scholar and Professor of Law and International Affairs at Pennsylvania State University. Larry has published widely and is worldly renowned in the fields of human rights, the interface between business and human rights. He's a specialist as well on issues concerning China, Chinese thought, and Latin America on global affairs generally. His work focuses on the interface between business and human rights. He researches and teaches about regulatory systems, global production and data-driven governance, economic globalization and human rights, transnational law and institutions, Marxist, Leninist political economic systems, and semiotics. And he has published widely in the fields, articles, book chapters, and books. Larry is most qualified to speak to us because he focuses particularly on the intersection between issues that concern us deeply here. The global, the obligations of global actors, of technological platforms, and at the same time, the governance of technological networks from this very open-minded a multicultural perspective, which I think speaks very much to the nature of enterprise that we have here, where we are juggling values from so many different directions and traditions. And I think there is no one who will be speaking more eloquently about that than Larry. So we are very privileged. And without further ado, let me invite Larry.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm just incredibly honored to have been given the opening role. It's usually either the worst possible thing that you can do or something very interesting. I hope that I will, at least if I don't give you something interesting to think about, at least amuse you for the next little bit of time. My task was actually a fairly difficult one. I was to frame the issues for the next 3 days or so, and I found that impossible. So what I'm going to try to do, and I'm a systems thinker, so what I'm going to try to do instead is maybe suggest some fundamentals and some ideas, very broad and very abstract, about what you might want to think about before you start tinkering with the bunch of little systems that you all are going to be tinkering with. And that's sort of what I'm looking at. The object is, of course, to avoid having to clean up when tinkering with systems produces nightmares. But anyway, that's sort of the gist of what we're doing. So this is an age of epidemic, of pandemic, and now of infodemic. I love these words. English is such a malleable language. All of these words and all of these conditions have one thing in common. They share a demos in common. That is, they share a connection to a place and a people who in these cases suffer from a physical or moral pestilence. And indeed, each describes a condition of plague, an equally ancient term, that connotes both the condition of generalized infestation and the act of infiltration. Each in its own way connotes pestilence, an infection of the body, including the body of the social collective, or something unwholesome, evil, physically or morally, and noxious. The underlying idea is of something that must be endured and eventually overcome. What the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed beyond doubt is the way that each of these epidemics feeds on the others, thereby producing synergies of pestilence that affects not just a physical state, but the moral social health of the body politic. Today, I want to consider the concept of infodemic in the digital age. By the way, if you haven't seen this TV show, it's really cool. It's a pandemic, the gist of which is passed by people speaking. And indeed, the essence of the pandemic is speech that makes other people crazy. And the symptom of this disease is an uncontrollable, sort of what I'm going to be doing for the next 20 minutes or so, an uncontrollable urge to say nonsense without stopping. It's a really great show. But I thought it was, it's really the theme for what we're going to be looking at. All right. So what is infodemic's principal characteristics? We start with the definition, and in its How to Build an Infodemic Insights Report in 6 Steps, WHO UNICEF tells us that an infodemic, this is a quote, infodemic is an overabundance of information, accurate or not, in the digital and physical space accompanying an acute health event such as an outbreak or epidemic. A lawyer wrote this, but it's very good. Again, it's an overabundance of information, accurate or not, in the digital and physical space accompanying an acute health event such as an outbreak or epidemic. 4 important causative elements of infodemic pestilence can be extracted from this definition. First is that information is a central element of infodemic as plague. Second is that a measurable quantity of information that exceeds a certain unspecified threshold triggers effects detrimental to the human social organism. Third is that the information combines both analog and digital sources. The invasive elements exist in physical and virtual spaces. And fourth is that infodemic is that infodemic is activated in this instance in the presence of a health-related plague. That is, in effect, it's constituted in relation to something else of equal magnitude. You don't have one without the other. Backwards. All right. So what is infodemic's principal characteristics? Sorry. So we're told, we're further told that infodemic consists of an identifiable set of symptoms. In the language, again, of how to build an infodemic insights reports in 6 steps, these consist of questions, concerns, information voids, where people seek credible, accurate information but can't find it, and circulating mis- and disinformation. Now, questions and concern are multi-directional signals. While it's in the nature of infodemic that affected communities of people have questions and concerns, it's also as likely that these questions and concerns then raise questions and concerns among those tasked with combating the informational dysfunctions causing infodemic in the first place. There are going to be all kinds of information loops here. And the forms of questions and concerns raised also shape the parameters for defining these terms. Information voids are a more immediate and measurable symptom built on references to what not void looks like. In this case, it's the measurable difference between the totality of information available and the aggregate total of credible, accurate information about the identified topic as a function of 1, its existence, and 2, the measurable difficulty of finding a sufficient quantum of credible, accurate information by a hypothetically ordinary person with a defined quantum of ideal training using some equally well-defined technology and knowledge. You're already beginning to sense the difficulties here. But you're also beginning to understand how this is something that may be more suitable to big data analytics and generative AI than it is for the humans. But these are the definitions that are built into the WHO UNICEF project. And these are the ways in which you move them from pretty words into something that is concrete. Again, the tinkering part. All of this, of course, is affected by the circulation of mis- and disinformation, which itself constitutes an important symptom and a definitional challenge in the context. And its effects on the body politic are dramatic, not just with respect to its formal constitution, but also with respect to its crossover effects on health-related plague. Its primary effects include, quote, causing information overload and confusion, promoting stigma, eroding trust in health authorities, affecting mental health and negatively influencing health decisions and behaviors, end of quote. The severity of these in turn may be measured by the difficulty of, quote, health authorities to respond effectively and protect the population's health, end of quote. Nonetheless, the terms are meaningless without a normative context in a specific space, place, and time. We don't get there. Right. The good news, however, is that there's a medicine for this pestilence, social listening, or in the Chinese, social monitoring, 社交监听, both slightly different in kind of interesting ways. Here again, international organizations appear to be in the vanguard. In their finding the signal through the noise, which we discussed earlier, a group of international organizations sought to provide guidance on the crafting and administration of this social medicine. They put forward the idea that social listening is a temporally contextual treatment and that one that is deeply tied to the physical contagion with which it's paired. When administered before the onset of physical plague, it can act as a vaccine. Here, the focus is on the health of the body politic as related to vaccine targeting. Nonetheless, it can be administered during the course of the physical disease. In contrast to its use as a vaccine, here the treatment is the administration of medicine whose efficacy is tested against its power to alleviate the physical symptoms of the plague, info, epi, or pandemic. The overall modalities of social listening do not change. What can be refined touch on target and focus, and that is a function of the point at which social listening is deployed on the body politic, and by whom. What does change are the technologies available for efficient deployment. Who UNICEF, for example, focuses on a, quote, taxonomy-based summary of computationally identified narratives, e.g. using social listening taxonomy for linguistic analysis of social media data. And this is on page 11. Here, one encounters an interesting external linkage between the self-referencing world of health on the one hand and the vibrant markets and politics-driven world of managing individual and consumer behavior through strategic analysis of and intervention in the chatter that constitutes mass sentience. The technology of social listening has seeped into all sorts of social relations, and its use increasingly essential for developing structures of communication between mass society and producers of objects, of norms, or social norms. In an August 2023 report, Reporter Linker suggested that the social media listening market was expected to grow from $7.41 billion to $14.21 billion between 2023 and 2028. The range of available social listening tools available for purchase or as a service has been growing as well, unregulated, into which who UNICEF is going to throw in their own. As having rating and in addition, a ratings market has also emerged, rating these social media, these social listening products that are now on the market, the top 20 or the top 15 of these things. Sorry. Okay. Social listening itself has become more refined as the power of big data analytics and the freedom to roam of generative AI makes possible more intimate probing of the body politic from out of the chattering of its components. So for example, July 2023 reporting from Forbes describes the growing salience of sentiment analysis, which involves, quote, interpreting and classifying emotions within social media context. It provides insights into public opinion about a brand, product, or service by evaluating whether the sentiment behind social media mentions is positive, negative, or neutral. Aggregated and approached as a dynamic state of flux, it permits both assessment of outlook and a basis for monitoring the effectiveness of interventions designed to produce aggregated changes in attitude. We can figure out not only what you're thinking, but how to change what you're thinking without you even knowing. And we've gotten very good at it. By we, I said not me, but someone who's making money at this. Okay. Social listening itself has become more refined as the power of big data analytics and the characteristics of contextual analysis of examining disease in place and space and on specific bodies touches on perhaps the most important manifestation of social listening as a function of infodemic. It's variable as a use of as a course of treatment. These are administered by the doctors to the body politic to mitigate the worst effects of an infodemic. Their content is the stuff of politics, science, policy, administrative capability, the premises and limitations of law, and the cultural patterns of social relations in the place where treatment is to be administered. Again, how to build an infodemics insight report in 6 steps is informative for revealing the structure of these treatment strategies. And this is, in fact, if you're looking at this from an epidemiological perspective, what you have here is a course of treatment for a disease, and the 6 steps, of course, to choose the question, identify and select the data, conduct an integrated analysis, develop strategies, develop an infodemic insights report, which is a big deliverable, and disseminate the IIR and track actions taken. These focus on the circulatory system of the body politic, its narrative and narrative pathways. We'll talk about narrative every once in a while, but really is a focus, as we've seen in all of this, the narrative about how people think and why it's natural for people to think in a particular way without them thinking too hard about why it is they're thinking this way. Narrative points to the health of the body politic as a function of the proper operation of its circulatory system, which is made up of narrative and is itself the path through which narrative travels. right? So in How to Build the IIR, they put it this way: in infodemic management context, narratives are units of analysis because they embed meaning, values, and emotions that can explain how people understand and share pieces of information. These embedded components of a narrative can be hijacked, or they can blend with mis- and disinformation narratives, which can divert people's attention into inaccurate understanding and interpretation of information. Or each of these techniques can be used to get people to think correctly. The techniques have no ideology, and they certainly have no morality, but they do have a use, and they're available to everyone. Narrative is not just the pathways and linkages within which information can be processed and delivered to the masses and back again. Narrative is also a bacillus, a virus, an object that can infect the body politic and cause harm. That is the harm that amplifies the parallel harm to physical bodies in epi and pandemic. Right, so we're now in a position to pause and consider these efforts from a perspective of greater generality and perhaps examine consequences. Even as humanity has been developing its epidemiology in the analog, the physical realm, so it appears that there has been a strong push to develop a parallel and interlinked epidemiology for the virtual world. The epidemiology of the abstracted body politic in infodemic, which is understood to be constituted through an endless flow of information representing constant iterations of functions constrained by framing principles of control and organization, now mimics epidemiology's approach to the care of the physical body in epidemic in surprising ways. This new parallel analog and virtual infodemiology applies the sensibilities and practices of epidemiology in the cause of a science of managing and mitigating an infodemic. That is, what's going on in your brain as opposed to what's going on in the rest of you. Again, they're rooted in a common focus, demos, a specific place and a specific people. They're founded on the sensibilities of aggregation and abstraction. Each is built on the constitution of an aggregated body whose characteristics, movements, trauma, healing are a function of what Foucault in a more analog age would have called the constitution of a population by the application of statistics. Each is based on listening, recording, aggregating, analyzing, and judging. These impulses are the manifestations of the application of the fundamental principles of essentialization and reductionism, taking the essence of a thing by eliminating extraneous characteristics, which you choose, and you may choose wrong. The collection of these essentials then serves as the bytes encoding a single character of the human onto societal programming. From these facts, from these data points, it's possible to develop a truth that serves the collective. Truth is understood here in its modern sense of consistency with facts, but it draws on an older etymology of trustworthiness. That truth, though, is always a function of and related to the facts that have been aggregated as extraction of observations of symptoms, physical symptoms of individuals, and social systems of the body politic. Reduction and essentialization produces the composite person or the composite body politic, an incarnated abstraction that represents a generalized truth intensely related to the data streams, that is the symptoms from which it's drawn. From it, judgment is made possible, judgment about how to treat a disease, how to minister to the body politic, and it permits an examination of causes from out of the iterations of observations of the individual actions that produce this reduced and essentialized composite. In the case of the person, germs, bacteria, virus, chemicals, and the like. In the case of the body politic, we now have a name for the disease vectors, mis and disinformation. It appears that the impulse to observe, aggregate, judge, and act is deeply built into the normative empirical cultures in the Occident as it's emerged from the time of Hippocrates and its epidemics. Nothing's changed. But it also features in non-Occidental frameworks in the rhetoric of rationally ordering reality around the human. Here one can draw on Guiguzhe's concept of intelligent naming, and I'm terrible in Chinese, ming-ming, for those who've read this, of drawing distinctions accurately and of extracting truth in the process, and millennia later of seeking truth from facts. Humanity appears to be applying the same ordering framework for the treatment of physical disease as it now applies more scientifically to the treatment of diseases of the body politic. That connection is intensified and transformed, where the traditional focus on material data is now significantly augmented by virtual or digitalized manifestations, and where the process of human rational processes have now been augmented or perhaps transferred to silicon-based generative embodiments of cognition. This is relevance not just as an amusement for philosophers and the developments of epistemologies in the age of AI. It is the basic principles around which one can intelligently maximize the utility of infodemic protocols consistent with the political normative framework with which it is to be applied. All right, so with this foundation, I want to devote the little bit of time that I have left to considering some of the more interesting and relevant consequences of infodemic. Relevance focuses on policymakers, state, civil society organs, and the masses, and it targets the rise of parallel ontologies, that is, the science of existence, of becoming and reality, applied to the field of exdemics, epidemic, pandemic, infodemic, all of which center on the human and the human within a certain place, a time in physical and virtual space. And it's important to remember this as you begin tinkering with these things. And so I'm going to end with just 6 consequences that may be more useful to you all as you begin working through this stuff. First, I've been considering some aspects of issues around the semiotics of listening, not in terms of output, mis and disinformation, but in the act of transmission. That is, how information can acquire the character of mis or disinformation in its journey from source to object. Beyond the exogenous issue of the fundamental character of data in context, that is, from the perspective of the object that is a bundle of data constituting information which may have inherent qualities of mis or dis, I've been curious about the endogenous character of communication as an element in the characterization of information. This lies beyond the contemporary debate on the exogenous character of quote-unquote information as either in itself or in context dis or misinformation when produced, when targeted, or how presented. In other words, and perhaps less abstractly, if one hears what one wants to hear or needs to hear because of the way that one is programmed, then it is possible to understand the nature of mis and dis as relational in the sense that its nature and impact is a function of the interaction between the producer and the recipient of data clusters and the character of the information. The same applies in the context of generative AI and predictive analytics-based systems. This might be most usefully understood in the context of the COVID pandemic, for which there were likely substantial lessons to be learned, and that would be the subject of another discussion. All right. Second, the epidemiology of infodemic currently starts in the middle rather than at the beginning. By way of example, the marvelously helpful WHO UNICEF approaches to managing narrative and infodemics through 6 steps of processes driven by sophisticated social listening technology takes for granted the underlying normative structures through which data, objectives, and analytics are understood. But that's hardly ever the case. The mechanics of social listening and its implementation takes as a starting point the premises for authoritative action drawn from the core rules of the political economic order of a place, and so on. You can't start in the middle and then not expect to be surprised when things go wrong. But that's essentially what one is doing in this context. All right. Third, these conversations are relational and self-reflective. And by that, I mean that no sense of objective or of analysis is possible unless it's undertaken in relation to something. That something is usually a reflection or a manifestation of what is sometimes called objectives, but which may be better understood as an ideal state of things. That ideal state, in turn, reflects the relation between the actuality of social relations measured against its perfection, where that perfection realizes all of the principles, premises, and aspirations of the social order within which it's deployed. In the case of Infodemic, in the shadow of pandemic, the center of that self-reflection are the central organs of authority for disease management and their complex interactions between international and national organs. But the intersubjectivity of infodemics and the construction of structures of social listening are in effect driven by the way that these subjects see, relate, and interpret the elements of the world around them relevant to a particular task. The subject is always at the center of webs of social relations, and not necessarily objectively so. Fourth, social listening is a two-way street. One of the greatest underexplored possibilities of social listening and the body politic, especially under conditions of epidemic, lies in the ability to use social listening technologies not just to manage, but to engage target populations. One doesn't merely work on a population, one engages with them. There's something to be drawn from them, not just working on them. Especially under, and it lies in the ability to use social listening technologies, not just to manage, but to engage, right? One can think of this as a mechanization and institutionalization of a tech-structured mass line, for those of you who are engaged in Chinese Marxist-Leninist politics, the well-known operationalization of the principle of democratic engagement central to the Chinese political system, but the operationalization of the Chinese mass line through tech and AI-based modalities will present differently when the liberal democratic or developing state approach is used as a template. In any of the three bases, either mass line, liberal democratic, or developing state, the ability to listen and from that to change what you're doing in the context of narrative may make all the difference in the world. Fifth, the effects of context and relational application raises issues of coordination and conflict management, the development of which has been elusive. The tragedy of whose internal bickering during the course of the COVID pandemic suggests that the techniques of social listening not only produce variation at the ground level, but it can substantially impede the work of coordinating bodies. And yet the management of the control of top-level organs may be crucial to the success and development of operational level social listening based infodemic control measures applied to population. If you don't have your own house in order, in effect, how can you possibly manage your target audience? And that may require you to apply social listening techniques within your organization as well as beyond it. The moral, of course, is the ancient one inscribed on the Temple of Delphi, know thyself, and that is a hard task indeed. All right. 6, one can only understand the nature, character, and effects of mis- and disinformation only by reference to the ordering subject. For example, the people driving whose work, or that at national levels. The terms have no solid reference other than from out of the premises, goals, objectives, and worldviews of the entities who relate to information as either positive or negative stimuli in relation to some activity or state of mind that is positively important or threatening to the entity and its enterprise. Misinformation points to falsity or inaccuracy, which may be intentional or negligent. COVID vaccines will cause women to bear four-headed children is an outlandish example of that kind of thing. Disinformation are statements made with intention to deceive, but the nature of the deception may not be straightforward. For example, deception may lie in the identity of the speaker. For example, when an instrumentality of a foreign state seeks to project its voice into host state politics, pretending to be a member of that political community, or it can relate to the information itself for disruptive purposes. For example, COVID origin debates. All right, 7th, hovering over this landscape, this ecology of mis and disinformation is the specter of intent. All right, intentionality suggests the freedom to choose. That is, to act on a desire that is not compulsory. Interpretive discretion at every level of the epidemiology of infodemics shapes and drives the mechanisms in course of treatment, the data selected, the identification of targets and objects. The identification and control of intent has been given its own field of regulation, accountability and compliance, but it's also a function of trustworthiness and ideology. In the context of social listening systems, it becomes a matter of quality control by coder, by supervisor, state official, or market. Someone has to be scrum master of this enterprise, and it's not clear that this system has been thought through. This is tied to the epidemiology of narrative and the circulatory system of the body politic. Its heart may be understood as the seat of intent and the core space of sentiment, but who knows the human virtual heart? Yet the heart may hide even from itself, and into this void may march generative AI. The last, and we're all happy about this, the last and eighth and potentially more far-reaching, what has been fairly straightforward of this fairly straightforward parallel between the epidemiology of pandemic and that of infodemic has now been complicated by the insertion of data-driven analytics and especially of generative AI. On the one hand, generative AI is generated in the image of its creator. It exhibits all of the biases, foibles, and normative value choices of its coders. But as an iterative-based operational system, it can take its original character in directions that may not parallel those of its creators. And yet, the critical interface now in the operationalization of social listening systems depends on an alignment, or at least a coordination between human personalities and their virtual generative selves. Humanity is barely at the start of a discussion about how this is meant to operate. Its governing organs have barely and most crudely begun a process of building normative structures, articulated as rules, around which that relationship may be advanced. These are all meant to mirror AI and physical life forms. It is not clear that this will work out in the long run. Plural subjectivity may affect approaches to infestation and infodemic in yet to be understood ways, especially in the context of narrative control and the constitution of mis and disinformation. More importantly, the character of mis and disinformation will change in the flow of iterative communication and reflect the baseline conceptualization cognition norms of those who code interpretation of facts and actions around them. Machines don't think like humans, and the way in which we will be moved through machine-based logical systems may take us in directions that we are not prepared to go. And perhaps I'll end these remarks and open the sessions to come with a provocation from the realm of science fiction. I'll end with this. This is from a science fiction book called Machinehood that was published this year. Humankind cannot expect to compete with intelligent machines forever, and the longer we attempt to do so, the further we'll drift from actual humanity. Our empathy for each other fades, dulled by the requirement to ignore our natural feelings for the machines and our machines. What sounds literary and contrived, in point of fact, well describes this new demos humans now share in common with the tech and analytics humanity has created, ostensibly in our own image. Together, they're constituting a new hyper-epidemiology, the subjects of which are physical people and programs, and the collective body of humanity and its virtual reflection in generative AI and its communicative fields of predictive and descriptive analytics. Social listening is an important first step in that direction, but not the last. It's instead a gateway to better understanding and to deploy hybrid human tech modalities for social relations in the physical and virtual worlds. And with that comes, as who understands, great challenges in meeting threats that may be as much a part of the new normative landscape as are its promise. None of this will produce viable regulatory or operational responses, especially respecting human rights and ethics, if those fail to consider the core issues which, whether they like it or not, will both constrain and drive such efforts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Larry, for those brilliant insights. Started off with very rich thoughts. So let me just ask the audience, we've got perhaps about 1 or 2 minutes for questions. Any immediate questions for anyone, points of clarification at this particular stage? To be sure, we do have time reserved at the end of the day for broader discussion. But meanwhile, any thoughts, any immediate reactions? Assistant? Yeah, please go ahead.
Do I just press the?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Sorry, what an amazing way to start. Sorry about your ears. Can we have an epidemic without a pandemic really stands out. And your exploration of the structures and the language and how we begin to grapple with these problems is incredibly exciting. The idea of hyper-epidemiology, I think, is really important. I think that we are at this inception stage and humans are always behind the systems that we install in our lives, and governments and legislation are always very disturbingly behind. And I think as communicators, what's going to be exciting about this conference is how we really work through these questions and issues. And for me, it's very enheartening to hear you talk about the epistemological side of the information, and actually that what we're talking about is this hyper-epidemiology and how we use all the techniques that we've very similarly used in epidemiology and other parts of public health to grapple with this new phenomenon. And actually that some of the problems that we've been told are the problems aren't really the problems. We've already got first principles of how we behave with public health. What we need to do is actually work through how we begin to think about who the observer is when we're observing, how that affects what we're doing, and what legislature, what structures are there to protect people while this galloping evolution happens. I mean, I could go on, but thank you. Incredible start.
Thank you very much, Stan, for sharing your thoughts. I think it's great to pick up on the point that you've mentioned, and I'm keen to hear what Larry thinks about it. So I was particularly struck by your point on social listening being a two-way interaction. But looking at the processes that have been put out both in the Gavi document and also in the Insight report, I do understand that these are technical documents. They're very linear. So I wonder how is it two ways that isn't that sort of interaction. Of course, from the Gavi document, we see the sequence of listening, communication, and then engaging in order to produce the Insight report. But it's quite different from, say, for example, when we think about social science research, when we think about something that's a lot more participatory in approach, where we want to try to draw in different perspectives. So I don't see that, and it got me a bit concerned. Again, I do understand that from an epidemiological standpoint, that's the sort of thing that you want to get, but I don't see how, in terms of co-construction, if we think about it in that particular terminology, how that's going to be animated and how that exactly links up with what you said about two-way or the absence thereof. I do wonder whether you have any further thoughts on that.
All right, I mean, you really put your finger on the issue. And I wish I had an answer. The only thing I can emphasize, and again, this is a problem. The Chinese have been much more transparent about the issues in the context of working through mass line and mass line politics than virtually anyone else. When you work on a target population, right? And this is what social listening is about. You're getting all kinds of information. People are babbling or people are being babbled to. And what you want to do is you want to change people's way, or you want to protect people in the way in which they think about things. You measure the success of what you've done by the extent to which you've gotten people to think or act the way you think they ought to. But people are much more complicated than that. And sometimes in doing that, it helps to hear what in the process of changing or protecting or working on people, that what effect that produces, that may in fact tell you much more and something very positive in terms of how you can better manage the context. And so if you don't have, it's basic iterative computational theory. If you don't have a feedback loop, if you've got a literal, just a one-way down and then you measure the effects, you're never going to develop a system that can become not autonomous in the sense that it's freewheeling, but a system that is self-generating and stable and that can be used in this context and other contexts. And so what winds up happening is we spend so much time worrying about how to work on people that we don't take the time to figure out how we can listen. And by listening, it doesn't mean, oh, yes, I've listened to you and now I'm going to accept everything you've said. But in the absence of listening, you've now essentially cut out a huge field of data that can be also useful, including the data, the quality control of you working on people. It may well be that what they're doing is horrible or horrifying. You don't know that. And so quality control suffers, and your ability to engage effectively with your target population suffer. And it's something that we don't think about. We've just so focused on step one. And I always worry that if we think that step one is also the last step, then things are never going to work out well. And we're always going to wonder why these things are just not, two things. One, they're not working well. And two, and far more dangerous politically, is we will wonder why it is that there is this tremendous, if irrational, political blowback, which we can't control.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you so much, Larry, for your thoughts. So there's a lot of rich insights and materials there. I'm sure we'll have to, I do hope actually, I'm not sure how much time we'll have to unpack a lot of the richness that's there. So, but in the interest of time, we do have to move on. So if you join me to thank Larry again for the wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. Thank you. As promised, there will be time towards the end. I'm sorry about the boom. It's like maybe I should be a bit further away. Yeah. So I promised that there'll be time towards the end of today to get back into discussion on some of these very important points that Larry has highlighted. Happy to say that because Larry mentioned the Chinese context, we will be hearing from Dr. Gao and Professor Cao tomorrow. As they share with us some of the developments on the mainland and some of the very rich insights that we can gain from that as well. But for now, happy to say that the next speaker, Dr. Theresa Senft, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your last name, you'd have to correct me. We'll be hearing from her. She is, as you see, illustrious in terms of her profile in the conference booklet. She's senior lecturer at Macquarie University in Media Studies. We have heard, well, some of us, her speak about the guidance from the Association of Internet Researchers. The document is fascinating to me because it draws on feminist ethics and speaks to the situatedness of knowledge. I'll be keen to hear how we could take that on in practice, and also this very important notion of the ethics of care. I think especially pertinent when we think about the health context. So Terry, as you see, has done immense work in space of communication and media. She is engaged in some very interesting project. I don't know to what extent she's going to speak to us about influence literacy, but for those here, we will have the opportunity to interact with Terry. But Terry, meanwhile, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
So, hi everyone, I am Theresa Senft, and I'm very excited to talk with you. I'm going to try not to talk New York style, which is usually too fast. Sorry, translator. So the title of this talk is What They Talk About When They Talk About Social Listening. And the abstract, I always want to read other people's abstracts and forget, so I thought I'd share mine in case you forgot. From research strategies to tools to job titles, social listening seems to be the rage these days. Yet few people seem to be able to agree on what that term means. How is social listening like and unlike older concepts like market research or data mining or digital surveillance? We okay? In what sense are geographically disconnected users on digital platforms social? And in what sense is the practice of using artificial intelligence tools to search for keywords online a form of listening? In this talk, I'm going to consider 3 domains where social listening practices are deployed, taught, and debated in very different ways. And they are corporate marketing, public health, and public security. I begin by outlining the definitions, strategies, and beliefs about social listening that seem to overlap or else slightly diverge between practitioners in these domains. Next, I consider a few contested hot button issues between these domains, considering why this is so. And then I close by talking about what public health stands to gain and what it might lose by developing ethical guidelines for social listening that prioritize a commitment to community care and service, as opposed to prioritizing a market directive for increased sales or else money saving, or else a political directive for increased national or local security, generally defined as freedom from enemies. I end by raising the issue of inclusion, stressing its unique ethical status for health authorities seeking to deliver effective interventions to targeted communities, which first requires public trust in its procedures. Okay, so that's the general Google Maps direction we're trying to head, and we have some stops on the way. So first, we're going to very quickly blow through terminology. What is an infodemic? What is a health emergency? And what is social listening? Then we're going to ask the question, who else does social listening and why? And how do these entities overlap public health entities? And how do they diverge from public health entities? Then we're going to move on to the context of infodemic management, because you can do social listening even in the context of public health outside of infodemic management. There's many uses for these processes. So we're going to talk about what it looks like in practice, the kind of tools that are used and the challenges that come up. And then I'm going to speak, and this is item 4, I'm going to speak in a quite concrete way, even if it's briefly, about the notion of ethics as method. And that is the idea that you embed sort of an ethical outlook at each stage of what you do. It's not something you tack on later. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about social listening, the notion of community inclusion, which is different than human rights, and how community inclusion often links up with notions of public trust, which is very, very important for health authorities. And as Calvin said, I'll mention some AIR guidelines, Association of Internet Researchers, mostly where you can locate them. So let's quickly go through infodemics, emergencies, and social listening. So I'm a girl who likes an infographic. So you can see this Venn diagram at the top. We have in purple infodemic, pink, we have public health emergency, and then, infodemic was blue. Pink was public health emergency, and social listening here is purple. So if we started with thinking about a public health emergency, which is that section in the middle, we see sort of a definition that says an extraordinary event that constitutes a public health risk and requires coordinated international response. That could be around an infectious disease. That could be around something like a chemical spill. That could be something like a release of radiation, right? The key word when we think about public health emergency, at least to me, is acute. And we'll go into these keywords in a moment because they tend to structure all the rest of our thinking. So let's look at infodemic, which is on the left, your left. An infodemic is an overabundance of information that affects health-related decision-making. And that can include misinformation and disinformation, as we've heard. It can also include malinformation, which is technically correct information that is meant to harm somebody politically. It could involve outdated information, and importantly, it can also involve information overload of, quote, good information, right? So it's actually, it's quite a wide net that this term is supposed to encompass. Happy to talk later about what we gain and what we lose when we apply the epidemiology metaphor to a conversation about information, but we're going to go with that for right now. So the key word here would be chronic, because these issues aren't going anywhere. They are ongoing. They may become particularly acute during an acute emergency, but they are always bubbling under the surface. On the right-hand side, we have social listening, which I've explained as a research method that involves gathering information about people's questions, feelings, and concerns regarding topics of interest. Now, in public health, the aim is to influence health behavior. Other entities use social listening for different ends, and we'll talk about some of those other entities in a minute. In public health, data collection methods can include things like offline data collection, interviews, surveys, focus groups, and then online, and that could include things like publicly available databases, social media searches, and so on. I want to say right up front that it is considered best practice within public health authorities to only be looking at publicly available social media materials. So no Telegram, no WhatsApp, no closed communities, okay? So the keyword I have here is routine. So now we have these three keywords: chronic, acute, and routine. And I want to talk a bit about the mentalities that come with each. So if you're talking about something that's acute, and here we were using health emergencies, the perception of time is urgent. Why does that matter? Because it coalesces into an emergency mindset. The desire and the push for action tends to be high intensity. There's a lot of discussions about triaging procedures, right? So we might want to do all these kinds of things, but what do we need to prioritize? You hear a lot in the field from people saying, well, we can get a special waiver if we need to do an emergency investigation. It also gets tied to what I would call expediency politics. One example would be the number of places where they passed legislation making it a criminal offense to circulate medical misinformation. And in some places, people get fined. In other places, people get jailed. I think that the pushback about those kinds of laws would have been different had we not been in an acute health emergency at the time. And public sentiment tends to move toward alarm and fear, and also a kind of institutional permissiveness. So the example I just gave before about being comfortable with jail sentences would be an example of that. Now, in the middle, we have chronic. So chronic I tied to infodemic, right? In chronic mindset, time is understood as sort of expanding, right? It just never ends. When will this ever end? We could start to think about something like long COVID as being in that area as well. Action is medium intensity. Procedures tend to get codified. So this is when you start to cook up guidelines, like we're being tasked to do, some of us, for the WHO. Institutional politics starts to really come up here. So there's many conversations about which division's job it is to handle which task, which again influences the policies that get put in place. And then public sentiment tends to things like fatigue and reticence and resistance. People just they're worn down, right? Now, the last one we have here is, the keyword is routine, and I have associated that with social listening. In a routine mind space, time is seen as measurable. So the most important thing in this mindset is you start to say, well, which period of time are we talking about? The mindset is also every day. So monitoring it can be a one-off activity, but increasingly it's seen as something you build into routine. Action tends to be low intensity compared to something like, being in a clinic. Automated, the procedures tend to be automated. And here you start to see a lot of push for money saving, ways to save money. Connected to that, you see entry of privatized politics and partners. And public sentiment here tends to, that shouldn't say fatigue, reticence, resistance. We're using the wrong version of the slides, but that's okay. Public sentiment here, it tends to be non-engagement. Most of this kind of stuff flies under the radar. Unless you have a slide that has a deep fake, then suddenly everybody wants to talk, right? So who besides public health uses social listening, and how do they use it? So here we have, if we start at the top of this image, we have in the blue background, I have the private sector. And then underneath that, on the yellow background, I have the public sector. Now, this is clearly a Western context and needs to be rethought a bit, particularly in a mainland Chinese context. But some of the things have a lot of overlap. So within the private sector, let's do the bottom first. Within the public sector, in the yellow, we have public health and public security. So those are two entities that I'm going to discuss. Ostensibly, they have a public remit, right, to protect the public. At the top, another group that uses social listening and indeed developed most of the off-the-shelf tools that anybody uses for these projects is the world of corporate marketing. Importantly, there's overlap. So you'll notice in the green box, I say corporate marketing can include companies that are marketing health products and services. So pharmaceuticals or insurance companies, right? So they would want that data. We also have in the orange box, public security can include companies that are marketing security products and services for example, safety profiling companies like Palantir. Okay, so having this in mind, hopefully will start to give us a big overview, because now I want to drill down into sort of ideologies. So in our three groups, we see here at the top, public health, and then we go to corporate marketing, and then we go to public security. And you'll see each column I have, why do they do it and who does it? So let's talk about public health. So why does public health engage in social listening? If you ask them, they will say to protect, improve, and promote population health. And population health in the context of a public health remit can be as small as a local neighborhood or as big as an entire country or the world, especially when you're talking about something like spread of infectious disease, right? So in public health context, who does social listening? There's usually two groups. There's probably others, but the ones I know are emergency preparedness, and those are the folks at WHO who tend to have remit over the infodemic conversations, to my knowledge. And then the other area would be risk communications and community engagement, which is an interesting hybrid of community engagement, which is what it sounds like, but also sometimes there's a slight public relations angle to that. There's where you would be interfacing with the press. Now, there's a very large and robust conversation that goes on in public health about how public relations is expressly not what they're supposed to be doing with social listening. It's not supposed to be about measuring people for damage control or reputation management of the WHO or the CDC or something like that. Now, why do I mention this? Because that reputation management stuff is exactly what happens in corporate social media monitoring. So let's take a look at that. So the remit for corporate marketing is to serve existing customers of specific companies, brands, and products, and determine potential customers, right? So we have a very different client in mind. And in corporate marketing, social listening tends to be practiced by divisions of advertising and branding, or else public relation for organizational promotion. So if a company has done something and people are upset about it, they will do social media monitoring to figure out how they can control damage. So those are the first two groups. Now let's look at public security. So why would public security do this? Well, to protect specific populations, and specific is important here, from events or persons, so not diseases, right? Events or persons that could cause significant danger, injury, or property damage. That's a very different conception of what the organizational remit is, as opposed to a public health authority or a corporate marketing agency. So who does this sort of thing? In public security, social listening tends to be practiced by divisions of crime prevention, counterterrorism, and interestingly and increasingly, public relations. So you'll have a police department who wants to get a sense of who's feeling citizen pushback. And so they start going on social media to see how they're doing and figure out how they can mitigate that reputational issue, okay? So these are the sort of three main areas. There are other groups that use social listening, but the reason I picked these three is because they overlap. So one way you can think about any kind of monitoring is as a defensive strategy, right? Usually you don't do it unless you're trying to mitigate something. So in a public health context, I have, the enemy would be diseases or natural disasters or chronic illnesses or adverse health behaviors or health illiteracy, or importantly, community distrust. I'd say actually that's the most important one. The methodological strategy in public health, their version of social listening echoes behavioral change research. It emphasizes first gauging community literacy and understanding and sentiment and values in connection with health concerns, not everything in the world. And that's very important. It's a big part of the mandate. You focus on health-related issues. And if you're not, you need to justify why you've moved your purview. The second one would be triangulating online findings with offline community conversations. And this links back to that risk communication and community engagement piece of public health. They don't just throw stuff out into the wind. In fact, I find it quite ironic that I've sat on IRB boards at academic institutions that talk about community engagement, and very rarely does anybody have a part of their research where they bring the stuff back to the community and get the community's input. So, whereas in public health, it's part of doing business. The third, and I'm not a public health worker, by the way, so I was pleasantly shocked to know this. Recommending interventions to promote desired health behavior. So you're not studying people just to study them. That's not what they do. And you're not studying people to sell them stuff. And you're not studying people to make sure they think highly of you. And then finally, continue to dialogue with community to assess the effectiveness of the findings and the interventions. Okay. Now for corporate marketing, the enemy is different. The enemy is rival companies, rival brands, sometimes within the same company, rival products, sometimes within the same brand, consumer disinterest, and consumer distrust. So when you do market research, what you're emphasizing is this: gauging current consumer satisfaction levels, triangulating online findings with offline focus and user experience feedback groups, and developing market segmentation profiles from the data you've collected. And then from those profiles, you recommend not interventions to help, but strategies to sell or upsell goods or services to specific market segments. Or you could also do it in a negative way to dissuade them from buying stuff from rival companies, right? In political marketing, we see a lot of this. So in public security, who are our enemies? We've got wartime enemies. We've got terror networks, domestic and international. We've got perpetrators of domestic crimes. And remember, the remit within security is always geographically bounded. So you could be beating your wife in another country, but if my jurisdiction doesn't cover it, I can't do anything about it. There's also this issue of enemies of the state, which is a glamorous way to say political opposition, and also a citizen distrust. So strategies here would involve more policing and control mechanisms, right? So for public health, you had a behavioral change model. For corporate marketing, you had a market research model. And for public security, you have a policing and control model. And here we're talking about surveying online spaces for illegal activity, frequently without public knowledge or consent. We have developing profiles of threats. That is to say, types of individuals or groups perceived to be posing a risk or potentially posing a risk. Then triangulating online findings regarding threats with local police, military, and security agency information. Then you have recommending intervention strategies to target the threats. And then at the bottom, you can have gauging citizen sentiment regarding police, military, or ruling party for the purpose of image management. Okay, so this is sort of my quick and dirty typology. So now let's return to this notion of infodemic management and talk about these tools. So we heard earlier about the Infodemic Insights report and the manual. So an Infodemic Insights report is a name for a document prepared by public health workers tasked with addressing infodemic related issues in specific communities during a specific period of time. So the Insight Report employs social listening to gauge health-related information seeking sentiment or behavior within a specific community. Then online findings are triangulated with offline data from interviews, focus groups, and so forth. The Insight Report then describes a community's circulating narratives, and we heard a bit about narratives earlier regarding the issues above. Then the report is supposed to assess the level of risk of these narratives directly related to the community being looked at. Then it recommends actions to protect and promote public health based on evidence drawn from social listening and consultation with field experts. So you don't just use that data, you then have consultations with experts, maybe about the demographic of the community, or it could be a legal expert about, how feasible a recommendation would be at the policy level, and so forth. So that is what a report is supposed to involve. Now, for that data collection, if you're talking about the online world, there are a number of off-the-shelf products that people can purchase. There's also one that's rolled out by the WHO. That is the one at the top. It's called EARS, Early AI Supported Response. Then there's CrowdTangle, Google Trends, and so forth. Now, it's important to know that each of these tools was developed to only look at a small number of platforms. In general, we're talking about Facebook, Twitter, some comments on YouTube, I believe. I've seen Reddit scraped, Instagram I've seen. So that's what we're talking about. So what are the limits? Well, these tools all work on keyword searches, okay? And that means they're looking at text. So what they can't handle is images. They can't handle sound. They can't handle video. They can't handle a word with an emoji after it, right? They can't handle language uses like irony or sarcasm. So, you know, we know that there is a contextual difference in English between saying, this is great, and saying, this is great. Subjectivity and comparisons, right? So I unfortunately have to go a little faster. So a quick example of challenges, this was brought up earlier. This would be the example of sentiment analysis. And again, that was a system developed by industry. And the quick and dirty way you do that is make a word chart, and you say, these are positive words, these are negative words, and positive and negative is the only thing you can really show, which doesn't in any way map to a public health understanding of people's experiences. And then I have to leave this, sorry guys, but ethics as a method, this is something that I did give a talk about, and I'm happy to turn you onto it in a different format. I went through each one of those steps in the manual and talked about some ethics related additions. An important one that I do want to highlight is some of these you will know, being academics, de-identify data and stuff like that. But here's one. Do anticipate requests from government agencies unrelated to public health to collaborate with you or share data you have collected. Bear in mind that agencies associated with law enforcement, national security, military, or other fields may interpret risks and benefits in ways that can often conflict with public health understandings of those terms. And do anticipate requests from private companies to collaborate with you or share data you have collected. Okay, bear in mind that the prime mission of any company is to sell its product to consumers. So the last thing I'm happy to share all of these slides with everybody. And the last thing I want to just show you is this graphic. If you look at the top with the white, this is what these tools are meant to understand. So if you look at the small white ball, you have individuals are internally experiencing things like meaning or belief or emotions, right? And then communities are supposed to communicate those things through words and sounds and images. If you fan out, you see monitors, human or AI tool-based, note the frequency and pattern of words, not images, not sounds, right? Related to a particular topic occurring on specific platforms at specific times. Then from there, analysts that are human or tool-based pick the most plausible or interesting findings of the monitors, generating narratives about what a particular community understands, believes, or is feeling at the moment. And then the last bit of that circle says insight report writers, always human, create documents that weave the analyst's narrative into a larger narrative about the health issue at hand in an effort to address it to date and then make recommendations. So super quick, what gets missing? So if we start from the white again, what gets missing in that next ball, the communities communicate ball, is that sentiment individuals feel. If you feel uncomfortable sharing something, you're not going to share it in a community. So that's missed by any kind of monitoring tool, right? Any non-public, private communication is missed with a monitoring tool. What about AI tools? What do they miss? Well, I mentioned it. Nearly all images and sound-based communications, and P.S. most digital platforms that young people use, TikTok, Twitch, all those platforms, you can't access those with these commercial tools. What about the next level, the analysts? What gets missed with analyst narrative building? Well, stories can seem plausible given what you can see in the data, but what about what you can't see? And this is why triangulation is key. At least in a public health context, people are just not making up stuff. And they're not relying on these tools for the stories. And none of these other fields should be doing that either. And finally, what gets missed with report writing? Well, larger narratives and recommendations are frequently prioritized according to organizational agendas. They can be tied to governments, perceptions of urgency, budget priorities, and so forth. And these are not going to be transparent to somebody outside the organization. There's always a story behind the story in every narrative. AI is nothing new in that regard. That is a basic premise of deconstruction. So I'm very happy to talk later and share this stuff, and you can check into the Internet Ethics Guidelines. And thank you for watching.
Okay, thank you so much, Terry. First in hard sciences and then moving into the normative. So it's a wonderful opportunity to get his perspective on a number of these developments. Importantly, I should mention that both Federico and Giovanni have done an impressive systematic review of the field. So they're going to share with us some of the findings, what it is that academicians have been concerned with, and I believe some public health practitioners as well. Correct me if I'm wrong. So we're going to start by hearing from Dr. Federico Germani. So he's going to speak on the ethical implications of infodemic management and social listening, drawing from the systematic review that I've mentioned. I'm not sure whether there'll be a lot of time to go into the method. I think it's an impressive approach. But for those interested, you're welcome to get in touch with either Federico or Giovanni. But first of all, over to you, Federico, and welcome.
Thanks a lot for the kind introduction. So it is my pleasure to be here today and present the results of the scoping review that we have been conducting on ethics and implications in social listening and infodemic management, together with a panel of experts handled together by the World Health Organization. So we have heard already a lot about the definitions of infodemic management, social listening. So we'll be extremely brief, just to set up the stage for the presentation. So infodemic is basically the presence of an extreme amount of information, generally associated with disease outbreak, like we saw during the pandemic. And this causes confusion, risk-taking, and ultimately harms individual and public health. And it can be indeed worse than co-presence of an outbreak of a disease, and also by presence of digitization. Infodemic management is instead the use of evidence-based strategies to analyze the infodemic and address the infodemic in order to decrease the impact this has on public health. And ultimately, social listening can be seen as a tool also for infodemic management as well, which is based on integrating and monitoring data from various sources, including social media. And this generates intelligence insights that can be used for actionable recommendation and policy making. So what we saw with the COVID-19 and what we learned with the COVID-19 pandemic is that there was insufficient preparedness for managing the infodemic. We have seen it with a lack of first-hand experience that we instead learned during the COVID-19 pandemic, but also lack of research, as we will see later on during the presentation. And the COVID-19 pandemic taught us that there are some important actions that are needed in the case of infodemics. And most of the actions that were taken went very well, and we learned some lessons, including, but not restricted to, the need for an ethics framework, which is to be considered not as an obstacle, like it was possibly considered before, to the effectiveness of strategies to deal with a pandemic and infodemic, but rather as a tool to increase the effectiveness of social listening and infodemic management strategies. So what we did so far with the panel of experts on infodemic management and social listening is to attempt to build a guidance document, which will be presented later on by Giovanni. But this guidance document is informed by expert opinion and first-hand experience, as well as by the literature and the work that has been done in the academic context. So this is what I'm going to present now, and it is based on the scoping review. So what we did is to define a query. This was a quite lengthy discussion with the panel of experts. Just to break it down in a very simple way, we have basically looked for papers, documents, guidance documents that were looking at the infodemic or what happens during infodemic, such as the presence of misinformation, of information voids, and also how we can respond to these threats. And also, of course, social listening. And also we looked at the context in which an infodemic can occur, whether we are in the presence of a chronic emergency, an acute emergency, and ultimately, and very importantly, we looked at discussions about ethics and ethical principles that we can apply surrounding the topics of infodemic management and social listening. So from this query, we retrieved from the PubMed, Web of Science and Scopus databases, quite a lot of papers, about 2,600, from which we removed the duplicates. We then screened from the inclusion criteria, looking at the abstracts of the papers and the documents. And inclusion criteria here on the right, so you see that we look for full text availability. We looked for mentions of social listening and discussion of social listening and infodemic management. This is, of course, a simplified version, but we have a lengthy expanded query that, if you want, we can discuss in details later on. And also, of course, we have a mention of ethics and all the ethical aspects that are surrounding these aspects. Based on this, we excluded most of the papers and came up with 218 papers, which we screened for the full text in details. And we ultimately included 103 papers in our scoping review. What we did to do that is to actually, mostly thanks to Giovanni's work, to generate a little software that we can use to manually assess all the papers for various informations, which helped us categorize in an easy and accessible format. For example, the different ethical principles that have been mentioned in this scoping review and all the papers included. So here for the results. So as you can see in this slide, we have a lot of different type of papers, theoretical papers, empirical papers, which is good. The problem possibly is that from the number of empirical papers that we only have a very small number of experimental papers, which is something we should consider for the future of academic research in this setting. But otherwise, we have quite a broad presence of different type of papers, including observational, cross-sectional, qualitative and quantitative papers, which is good to see. When we look at the type of health emergencies, we have most of the papers that are dealing as expectable with pandemics and epidemics. In particular, of course, COVID-19, but we have some other papers on H1N1, for example, or HIV. Some papers, 24, deal with infodemics in specifically, mostly again about COVID-19, but we have also some papers touching upon vaccine hesitancy. But we have also some others that look at more chronic health emergencies, such as smoking, alcohol, obesity and nutrition or food risk, or environmental hazards as well, such as radioactivity, floods and disaster. And a few other papers that are more general about and do not specify which health emergency the principles discussed apply to. So as you can see, we looked at papers from 2002 to 2023. In this time frame, what you can see is that most of the papers have been published between 2020 and 2023, so in the time of pandemic, which is kind of underlying the fact that before the pandemic, we did not have much research available on these topics, and that's why we came to the pandemic in a context of what we would define as epistemic underdetermination in the context of infodemic management and social listening. And here is the interesting part of the analysis. So if we look at the ethical issues in infodemics and infodemic management, first of all, what we did was to look at, just to get an impression of what is being discussed, we looked at the most represented dilemmas in these different papers. And what you can see is that in infodemics, some words pop up such as health, information, trust, and in infodemic management, we have very strong presence of public, social, or data. And we will see how this return into our analysis and why these lemmas are particularly important. So the first thing was to look at the different ethical issues that are considered in the different papers. And what we did is to just classify them, categorize them, and look at how many papers touch upon them to see how relevant they are in the literature. And what you can see is that the problem of trust and mistrust is the most represented one in our corpus of papers, followed by surveillance and social listening. And here I will highlight the most important ones in terms of how represented they are. Of course, all of them are relevant. Then we have the right to be informed truthfully, so the communication and outreach aspect. Vulnerabilities and inequities are considered. The problem of allowing free speech versus regulating information and censoring, for example, misinformation. Then we have the problem of having a public that is not very educated about, for example, does not have information literacy or media literacy skills. The right to privacy, the lack of community engagement, we heard about this before. And then, for example, informing versus manipulating our target public into a desired public health behavior. Now, if we look on the other side about what are the ethical aims in infodemic management and social listening, we find a lot of common themes, but of course, we are not looking at something like that is problematic, but more something that we look at as a potential solution for the problems. And we will discuss this later on. So here you see that we have the main aim of these activities would be to inform the public truthfully. So the communication and outreach aspect, which is coming well alongside community engagement, which you find in third spot. Surveillance and social listening, as we saw before, it is also an issue in per se that has to be considered and discussed, but it is of course also an aim if we consider infodemic management. Then we have trust, transparency, the need to have educational strategies and to define them as well. Inclusivity and equity. We need to ensure that we have fact-checking and labeling misinformation and debunking misinformation in place, privacy and anonymization, and also, which is the ultimate goal, to influence and improve public health. Also fostering cooperation between institutions. And finally, among the most represented ones, we have the need to transform evidence gathered, for example, by first-hand experience or by research into communication and policies. So what you see here, I basically present you the same results that I showed before, but in a sort of a visualized structure. And what you can see is different processes, broad processes that we identified as being important both as issues in infodemic management, which is something you find on the x-axis, and as aims of infodemic management you find on the y-axis. So the circle, the bubble, is telling you how big it is, means that the process has been more represented in the corpus of papers analyzed in the literature. And the more on the right means it is more considered to be of an issue in infodemic management. And also it can offer solutions the higher it is along the y-axis in infodemic management, social listening. So just keep in mind the colors of these different processes, because we will break them down now in the different principles. So you can see here that if we look at this, we find a few interesting clusters. The most relevant ones are probably the communication and outreach cluster, the surveillance and social listening cluster, trust, and vulnerability, inequity, and inclusivity. And if you go a bit more left down, we see another cluster which comprises other principles such as transparency, the need for public engagement, education, privacy, free speech versus regulation, but also honesty, avoiding conflict of interest, the need for research, and epistemic underdetermination. So we will see this in details, but I will be focusing for the sake of time on two. So the communication and trust and surveillance and social listening, and we'll look at how the literature is identifying different solutions for these problems. So what came out of the literature is that concerning trust, we need to first of all embrace public involvement. So we need to avoid looking at top-down approaches and involving more the public in decision-making processes. When I discuss this sort of guidelines or recommendations that are stemming out of the literature, we have to imagine as stakeholders, public health institutions, or, for example, Department of Health within governments, just for you to visualize better how this can be integrated. And this includes also the World Health Organization. Ethics should be prioritized in the sense that profit-oriented mindset should not be the goal, but rather public welfare should be the goal. Trust in research and researchers should be expanded, and integrity should be maintained. So this means that, for example, even if it's for a good cause, we should not manipulate the public into a certain public health behavior. So we should rather, as you see on the right side, inform than shape policies. And then, of course, this is basic, but credibility and expertise should be the base of the process. And also collaborations between various stakeholders should be fostered. And this includes, for example, also the private sector. And then something that is less obvious, perhaps, is to adopt a business-like approach. So learn from the corporate sector and consider also branding and advertising the services that are meant for public good. So if we think about the World Health Organization, for example, this could be highlighting more the benefits of the work of WHO and not only looking at the goals of, for example, informing the public. So if we look at this, looking at the bubble graph that I showed you before, we have trust, and from trust, we can then derive different procedural principles. So we can look at trust as a core principle, and of the different principles based on the solutions that I just discussed, we can identify, for example, transparency, honesty, and avoiding conflicts of interest, public engagement, translating evidence into public health practice, openness, and autonomy. And now looking at the second case, surveillance and social listening, what comes out of the research is that informed consent, albeit not always possible, of course, should be prioritized in social listening approaches, except in situations where there is relevant protection in place, which means guaranteeing anonymization, privacy, and cybersecurity. The data collection should be transparent, which means that the public should be informed about why data is being collected and for which purpose. And this is something that has been discussed by Larry before. I put it in different words, but the idea is to prioritize active social listening to passive social listening approaches whenever possible, which means looking at what the public thinks about and integrating the public into the very design of social listening itself. And then, of course, we have to set some ethical boundaries, which has been discussed by Terry before. Avoid, for example, giving away data that can be used for this descent tracking. There is an aspect about bias that is also important when we strive for an inclusive way of collecting surveillance and social listening data, which means that we have to already in the design of it ensure that data that we collect is not biased, meaning that it represents the communities and the public that we are looking at for real. We also have to ensure that we have effectiveness in our social listening structure and strategies, which means, for example, having real-time monitoring of information. And this includes also, of course, offline sources to avoid having the bias I was talking about before. Public concerns should be addressed again. The public is very key and central. And as I said before, privacy rights should be considered. So putting this into a graph again, considering everything around surveillance and social listening, what we need to do procedurally to ensure ethically sound measures in infodemic management social listening would be to consider all aspects touched upon in communication and outreach, having transparent approach, again, engage with the public, considering privacy, cybersecurity, autonomy, that the final goal is to ensure peace and democracy and good governance, and also try to find ways to merge data into something that can be openly available for policymakers and the public alike, that is easy to assess, perhaps in a single or a few platforms. So coming to some conclusions, we have seen that most of the research identified by the scoping review is coming from the experiences learned with the COVID-19 pandemic. And as I mentioned before, the crisis response that was led by the World Health Organization for COVID-19 happened in the context of broad epistemic underdetermination. And this means that we did not know much about COVID-19 itself, but we also did not know much about how to deal with the surrounding infodemic and information crisis. So we didn't know, for example, a lot about risk and crisis communication before the COVID-19 pandemic. And so this gap has been filled with a lot of important field experience and also with research. And we identified what we think are ways to improve forward from here. So a lot has been done that was excellent, but there is some areas where ethics, and again, I remind you, the aspect that ethics is not here considered as an obstacle, but as a tool, can help us improve the effectiveness of infodemic management social listening strategies. And these 5 key elements are to build and engage more with the public, to engage more in active social listening strategies, to be transparent about why we need, in the first place, social listening and what it is used for. And also, this is something relevant, which is kind of coming across all the different principles that have been analyzed. Just consider these are just 2 of the many that we looked at, is acknowledging uncertainty. So just to make you a practical example here, this would be saying when we do not know something about a virus, a pandemic virus, especially in the case of COVID-19, whether COVID-19 is airborne or not, there has been a phase of the pandemic where this information was not available, and yet this information was not conveyed in a way that we didn't know. So the public had the feeling that there was knowledge, and then this knowledge was later on contradicted. And also, building resiliency is extremely important. So again, looking at the public, but not only from the design perspective and how we can integrate the public, but now also looking at educational strategies, how to build information literacy, media literacy, critical thinking skills that can be used to understand misinformation versus accurate information. We are doing a lot of work in this sector, but also looking at research in this field, because we do not know how to teach these skills. What are these skills? So there is a lot of work that is needed here. And we think that this, with these takeaways, we can find a way to reduce societal polarization and increase trust, because this is as we saw, the main issue identified. And the main problem, because of course it impacts all the different aspects, and it has a direct effect on the effectiveness of infodemic management strategies and ultimately public health response and measures, which is the ultimate goal of our analysis and what we are discussing today. So with this, I conclude, and thanks a lot for your attention.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you so much, Federico. Thank you. Yeah. One is trainings in philosophy, but it's hard to say, given that you've been programming and developing algorithms. So including this particular search mechanism that we see. So Giovanni is going to speak a bit about that, building on what we have already heard from Federico. So welcome.
Yeah, I will try to do my best still. So I will briefly, in my presentation, I will briefly explain how the findings of the review and the input of the expert group have been incorporated, or maybe better, are being incorporated in the development of this ethical framework for infodemic management. First and foremost, another important premise at the end of my presentation, there's going to be a QR code to download all the slides because I'm much into open science. So if you want to download them, use them, feel free to do that, or to take pictures as well. This work is in which we are involved as rapporteurs is the joint effort of two units of the WHO. We have the Unit for High Impact Events Preparedness, Department of Epidemic and Pandemic Preparedness and Prevention on the one hand, and on the other we have the Health Ethics and Governance Unit, the Department of Research for Health. This process is at the intersection between these two areas. And there's a lot of people's work and input and contribution to acknowledge here. I will not read all the names because that will take us the entire time between us and lunch. But it's important for me to acknowledge the input and the contribution of all these people, and that's why this slide is included in the deck. Let's go to the content. First and foremost, we've been talking a lot about infodemics and infodemic management, so I don't think there's much need to go over that. Again, we're talking about too much information, including false or misleading information in digital and physical environments during an acute event. And all of this leads to confusion, risk-taking behaviors, mistrust in health authorities, and so on. While infodemic management, on the other hand, and definitions are important for the structure of the document we are mentioning because of, well, we are still having these conversations. And it's important to agree on these kind of definitions before going on. They are foundational to the entire structure of the document. And in this context, for this process, we consider infodemic management using the official WHO definition as the systematic use of risk and evidence-based analysis to manage the infodemic and to reduce its impact. And it's about listening to community concerns, to community questions. It's about promoting understanding of risk and health expert advice. It's about building resilience and so on. When it's about defining the problem, we have these three areas of concern or of ethical significance to juggle with. The first is the effectiveness, the efficacy, the public good, or the usefulness. We are still playing a bit with these definitions, as I was saying. So we want our infodemic management process to produce benefit in real life situations. Then we have autonomy, understood as, understood differently depending on the context, because let's keep in mind that we are trying to shape an ethical framework of global relevance, which is not a trivial effort. Autonomy is super context sensitive. We understand it as the combination of intentionality and non-control. And finally, we have fairness as justice, as a comprehensive set of basic rights and liberties that can coexist with similar rights for all. Out of this juggling, we have a set of issues summarized at the bottom of this slide emerging, including, for instance, the vulnerability of individuals and of communities, including active freedom of information and passive freedom of information. We have the huge cluster of trust, transparency, and trustworthiness. We have privacy, confidentiality, and consent, and many more. The ethical issues that we face in the context of infodemic management tend to emerge from the balancing of these three clusters of entities. And the aim of the guidance document is to guide organizations and individuals that are seeking advice on how to ethically engage in social listening. As Federico was saying, ethics should not be an add-on for this kind of processes. It should be based on protection of and respect of human rights. it should be a crucial part, a core part, I would say, of infodemic management protocols before as a preparedness effort and during health emergencies. So it's about navigating these tensions from these three clusters. And this is the process in a nutshell. Andreas will speak about that more in detail. So first we define the activities and the context, what is infodemics, what is infodemic management. Then we identify the risks and the challenges, so the potential harm that can result from the failure to address these tensions or to navigate these tensions. Then the aims, so which are the moral values that we want to pursue with this kind of activities, all the way down to defining guiding principles, so our process aims, where we want to go, and finally to an implementation guidance. I like this notion of ethics as practical wisdom. So I am a philosopher by training, but I much view in this entire process the final result, which is something that should be applicable in real life. So how to get there. And this effort, as Federico was saying, is based on two separate categories of input. We have the literature, so what we see in the scoping review, how social listening is characterized, how infodemic management is characterized, which are the ethical issues already identified, and which are the solutions already identified in literature. All of this is complemented with expert consensus, so with the opinions and with the reflections of the expert group. And as Federico was explaining, the role of the expert group is quite significant, has been quite significant already in the review process, in that, for instance, the search strategies have been revised multiple times with the expert group. And the role of the expert group becomes even more relevant in the discussions leading to the write-up of the document. So that's how we are organizing our input in this process. And now I will tell you a bit. I could basically boil down my entire presentation to this one slide, because that's what I want to convey you, the structure of the document, what's going to be inside it. It's not final yet, but the structure is already quite set. So we have a foundation section in which we have the aims and the scope, what the document is about, what kind of issues are addressed by this document, followed by the target audience, so for whom the document is intended, a general introduction which contextualizes the kind of health emergencies we are talking about, what we talk about when we talk about preparedness, prevention, response, impact of infodemics, and so on, and a lengthy section on definitions, because as I was saying, definitions in this context are foundational. We need to have clear in mind what we are talking about when we talk about a health emergency. We need to have clear what we talk about when we talk about public good. We cannot use these notions. And again, here, this is my philosophical training speaking, but we cannot use these notions in a vague and fuzzy way, especially if we want this stuff to be applicable. Then we have a section justifying the reasons of being of this entire document. So the importance of ethical guidance as a core component, not as an add-on for social listening and infodemic management, including the context of use. We discussed a lot with the expert group about this peacetime in quotes versus wartime in quotes, so response to acute events versus signal detection and monitoring. We have a focus on the risk of unethical practices in social listening and infodemic management. So what could happen if we fail to navigate that tension between these three clusters I was mentioning at the opening of my presentation. Then we have a section presenting the process, so how this document is being realized. A section on the alignment with the findings of our scoping review, including the challenges that we are facing, for instance, power imbalance, working with uncertainty, legitimacy of actors. All of these challenges are not like something invented, but something kind of well documented, at least discussed in literature. And then we have the core structure of the document, which goes from, I would say, a theoretical level to a very pragmatic level, starting from this need of striking a balance, or at least trying to strike a balance between these different entities we were mentioning, We have a section on, so that's what makes it difficult. We discussed a lot about metaphors today, and I think, I like topographic metaphors. I think that's quite clear that I had this in mind when making these notes on this slide. So what makes it difficult, why this journey is perilous, where we want to go, our overall plan, and how to get there. That's like the planning of an adventure in the mountains, if you want. We have our process aims, which are where we want to go. So protection of and respect for human rights, epistemic justice, fair and inclusive decision-making, integrity. This goes down to the principles level, so guiding concepts that help us translating process aims, so where we want to go in practice, avoiding or reducing risks. And finally, we have the theory to practice, the implementation tools, so the practical guidance to translate these process aims and then principles into actions. And that's the overall architecture of the document. And at the core content, I'd like to speak briefly about this. I don't have any idea of the time, but I will try to be brief. These are the core challenges that we identified in the process. First and foremost, it's about managing power imbalance and guaranteeing good governance. And I think this was very clear from Terry's presentation on who is engaging with social listening. We have power imbalance and we need to govern that in a fair way. And then the second challenge is uncertainty. We have epistemic undetermination as a core concept, a core issue that we need to address in this context, because often in the context of infodemics, evidence is emerging by time. It's partial at the beginning, and you need to take concrete actions based on what would be a good explanation, but might not be a final explanation. And this is connected with truth, revisability, reliability, and certitude. As I was saying, we want all of these to be effective. We want all of these infodemic management processes to produce effects, ameliorative effects in real life, in a real context. And finally, we want to identify and understand who are the legitimate actors, which circles back to good governance. And as you see, this is still work in progress. We are still having discussions on this. These are the main process aims which we have identified for good infodemic management. Starting with the protection of and respect for human rights. We want, there shouldn't be any trade-off between effectiveness or efficiency. And again, we could enter into the terminological distinction between these two concepts and human rights. There shouldn't be any trade-off. We want these processes to pursue epistemic justice. We want to preserve and build trust as a core process aim, reciprocal trust and trustworthiness as well. We want to apply fair, equitable, and inclusive processes of decision-making throughout the entire pipeline, and we want to guarantee the integrity of actors and actions. And then we want to value community engagement in infodemic management. We want to pursue understandability. We want these processes to be driven by beneficence, effectiveness, and community benefit. And we want them to be balanced by necessity, utility, proportionality, and least intrusive approaches. These are, in general, the process aims, which are, as you now know, situated in that part of the general architecture of the document. These process aims are going to be translated into principles that help translating challenges and aims into codified processes. Again, using a metaphor, this is somehow the RNA which translates the DNA of this entire process into something which can then be translated into a protein. And again, we are still working on this cloud of principles, but in principle, sorry, the pun is not intentional. There's going to be accountability among them. There's going to be transparency. There's going to be openness, inclusivity, independent oversight, privacy and data security, longitudinal reevaluation and sunset clauses, and so on. That's the role of the principles in the overall architecture of the document. And finally, we will have, as I was saying, the most practical element of the entire thing, the guidance recommendation. section, which will help shaping concrete actions according to ethical desirability. They will target specific stakeholders, and that's why it's important to define the processes, what is infodemic management, who are the actors, why or on which grounds they are legitimized to be doing or engage with infodemic management, to which degree. And we are going to adopt a life cycle approach. So this actor at this moment, at the generation of the research question, which informs the creation of the infodemics insight report, should take into account this and this and this, as in a checklist. And that's it. That's the general architecture of this document. In short, we discussed at length at this point. I will say about what infodemics and infodemic management are, and about the kind of challenges they pose from an ethical point of view, about the need for an ethical framework as a core component for infodemics management, about how we are developing, like what's the kind of evidence based on which we are developing this document, and then about the architecture of this document with a brief focus on the challenges, the aims, and the principles. And that's it. This is a strip from another project on which we are working. It's a graphic novel to empower Gen Zs in partaking democratic discourse on pandemic management, which I think is kind of an ironic note to conclude this discussion. That's the kind of things we are talking about. And finally, here you can download all the slides, scanning the QR code, and thanks a lot for your time.
Okay, thank you so much, Giovanni.